Okay, here's another story from Rabbi Mendel Futerfas. This story is called The Deep Sea Diver. Once there was a Farbringen in Kfar Chabad, and they were talking about this mivtza, this, what do they call a mivtza, this idea that the Rebbe came out that right before the 6-day war to go out and put tefillin on Jews in the street. Right before the 6-day war, this was a month or something before. And the Rebbe said this will give power to the Jews and will save the Jews and etc. And of course, we know what happened. The 6-day war was an amazing miracle. But nevertheless, this was a totally new thing. Maybe at the time of the 6-day war, people were sort of uncertain. So people were willing maybe to put on tefillin. What'll it hurt? But afterwards, we already won the war. And Chabad kept going out even more and more and putting tefillin on the streets. This was an unheard of thing. This was not, the religious people just kept to themselves. They kept as far away from the non-religious people as possible. It only meant trouble to get, they don't stir up a sleeping lion, just let them go. And the Rebbe in Lubavitch said, no. These people, they're Jews. They're just Jews like everybody else. They want to do the commandments. That was like an insane idea. The Jews these Israelis want to do the commandments. They were against, they hated religious. You have no idea the hatred and the disgust that these people had built up, and there was books written, and they had a whole culture. The drive that they wanted to be, accepted by the non-Jews and be just like the non-Jews, and it was impossible to dream that one of these Jews would put on tefillin. It was like it was insulting to go up to somebody and ask them to put on. But the Rebbe said it's not so. You go and ask people, and you'll see that they'll put on tefillin. And sure enough, it worked. People put on tefillin. It's true there were a lot of people that yelled anyway, but nonetheless, people did put on tefillin in the streets. But still, it was a weird thing. It was a strange thing. So they had a Farbringen in Kfar Chabad, and there was Rabbi Mendel Futerfas. So I talked to you about Rabbi Mendel Futerfas before, and he was talking about that he really didn't understand what the Rebbe wanted from this. If the Rebbe wanted it, must be good, but we have to try to understand it a little bit. What was the goal of making all these Jews putting on tefillin? So Reb Mendel said, all of a sudden he remembered a story. That when he was in Siberia at hard labor as everybody, the nights were very long, and they locked everybody up in their barracks because they didn't want them to work at night, so they didn't want people running away. And sometimes people would tell stories. So there was one person there that he told stories. Now, when Stalin got into power, as anyone that was remotely connected to the Tsar or in the Tsar's army or the Tsar's navy or anything like that, he had them all thrown into prison. Most of them had killed. So there was one person there that he claimed that he was a deep sea diver. What do they call a scuba diver? But there was no scuba. He was a deep sea diver in the army, in the navy of the Tsar. That's what he said. What was a deep sea diver then? They would put this big sort of uniform on a person, and it was like airtight, and there was a window here you could see through, and there was a tube that went up to the ship. And up to the ship, they would pump air so you could breathe. Why did they have a deep sea diver? What was it for? Because sometimes the Russia took very great pride in its navy. And once in a while, what happened, that a ship would sink. And when a ship would sink, so there was a lot of metal there. Sometimes the motors would work. Sometimes everything would work. It just hit something, or something hit it, or whatever, made a hole, and it would sink. So they wanted to bring the ship up in order to bring it and tow it in to fix it. But sometimes it was down there deep. So what would they do? They would send a deep sea diver, one or two. They would send them down, and the deep sea diver would go and locate this ship, sunken ship, and he would tie they would lower a couple of chains. He would tie a big chain into the front, tie a big chain to the back, maybe 4 chains. Then they would bring other ships on above, locate these 2 ships above. They would link these 2 chains to hoists that would be on these ships, right? The 2 ships that were up there on both sides of the sunken ship, and they would hoist the ship up, the sunken ship up. They would lift it up until it was well above the bottom of the ground, and then they would go with it, travel and go into the, this 1 second, it's my son calling me. 1 second, oh, stop the thing. Hello, sorry, go back to the story, huh? So they would bring these 2 ships above the sunken ship, and they would link up these 2 chains to the sunken ship. So they would lower them for the 2 ships down, and they would, anyway, whatever it was, and these ships would lift the ship up. Now this would work as long as the ship was under the ground, under the water for a certain amount of time. Then it would start rusting. When it would start to rust is then the places where they would attach these 2 big hooks. They would attach them and they would pull up the ship, and then the ship would come apart because the ship was rusty. I don't know when ships start to rust, after a week, after a month, after half a year, whatever it is, but however long it was, but there were still good parts on the ship that they could still, if nothing else, just the iron, they could melt it and make one. Anyway, so that was his job. His job was, he was one of these deep sea divers, and they would lower him down, and he would hook these big hooks that were attached to these big thick chains, one to the front of the ship, one to the back of the ship, and they would lift it up. But if the ship was old, what would they do? So somebody invented a way to lift up these ships that were rusting. What was the way? This person took a big mat of rubber, and on this mat of rubber, he made little holes in the mat, and on this, he put a big plate, a thin plate of iron, that from this plate of iron came smaller chains, or maybe metal rope or whatever it was. And he made them go through the holes, and he put little hooks at the end of each one of these thin chains that came down. And then he would seal it up. And on top of this, he would put another big piece of rubber. So it was almost the size of a ship, huge. And it was possible to blow this thing up, to expand it, to pump water in, to pump air in, so that the thing would blow up. Okay, so they tried it, and they located the ship that had sunk. They took this big, huge mat, which had rubber on up top, rubber on the bottom, and this big iron plate in the middle with these hooks coming down from it. And the deep sea divers went down, and they lowered it down on the ship, and they hooked these hooks on like 200 different places. And then they had another tube that went into this big mat, and they pumped it up, and then filled up with air until finally it was possible to lift the whole ship up gradually from the ground, because it was evenly distributed. Instead of just hooking one to the beginning of the ship, the front of the ship and the back of the ship, they sunk it, they hooked it to 500 different little places all around the ship. They knew how to do it. And when they expanded this big mat, so it lifted the ship up and they could tow it in. So Reb Mendel said that every story he heard, and he heard a lot of stories when he was in Siberia, and everything that he saw and everything that happened, he tried to learn from it a lesson on how to serve God, or to appreciate God, or to appreciate something good, to learn a lesson from everything. He said everything he did except for that. He tried as much as he could. He couldn't figure out what possible lesson can you learn from this weird story about a rusting ship with a big mat and all the hooks coming down and expanding it. So he said, now all of a sudden, he got it. Said the sunken ship is the Jewish people. And they've been sunken already for 2,000 years, and rust is starting to set in. and they're all separated one from the other. You can't just lift up one Jew and another Jew and everybody will come up. So what does the Rebbe do? The Rebbe sends all of his shluchim out, and they have little hooks. That's the tefillin. And he hooks these tefillin to this person, and to this person, and this person. This one has tefillin, this one has tefillin. Till finally thousands and thousands and maybe millions of Jews have these hooks on them. Then all of a sudden it'll be, what does it say? Ruach HaPeinu Mashiach Hashem. Hashem will inflate this with the spirit of Mashiach, lift all the Jews up, and then it'll be possible to fix the whole Jewish people. And that's what's possible to learn from putting tefillin on every Jew. See you all tomorrow. Today, 3 o'clock.